and welcome to ABI Podcast. This is Melissa Jacoby. I'm a law professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and also the resident scholar for the American Bankruptcy Institute for the spring 2016. So today I'm talking to Nathan Bomey. He's a journalist with USA Today, but formerly of Detroit Free Press. I think Nathan's name will be familiar to those who followed the Detroit and GM bankruptcies, both of which I think involved a huge learning curve. But he has a book coming out, a release date of April 2016, Detroit Resurrected, To Bankruptcy and Back, published by Norton. And I was lucky to get an advanced review copy and am looking forward to talking to Nathan about that book and some other related things. So welcome, Nathan Bomey.
Hey, thanks, Melissa. It's great to be with you, and you, this case, probably better than most anybody on the planet. So it's an honor to talk to you about it.
Well, thanks for the compliment. I've been looking forward to interviewing you to turn the tables a little bit here. So let's start with these kind of cases requiring a deep dive. So how long had you been at the Free Press when the Detroit bankruptcy hit and you were assigned to it?
Great question. So I had been at the Free Press for about a year and a half, a little less than a year and a half when the bankruptcy began. And, when it was coming, when the city of Detroit sort of, was out of options and the end was, the end result was likely to be bankruptcy, we obviously saw that coming. And at the Free Press, we coordinated a whole team of people who covered the bankruptcy, and I was a key to that team, ended up as the lead reporter. But there are many different people who covered the case because there were so many different aspects of it, and it was such a dynamic story. But I had been there for about a year and a half covering General Motors, and so then began covering the bankruptcy at the same time. So it was quite a busy stretch, as you may imagine.
So what do you wish you had known? You've learned so much now about bankruptcy law, and of course your book is really about the juicy and colorful story behind the scenes. If it were a movie, we might even have to give it I don't even know if it would be a PG. We'd have to go for PG-13 for language at least. But that may not have been your focus in the beginning as you tried to think about the law. So what do you wish you had known at the beginning, now that you've gone so far?
Good question. So I'll give you a story that I don't think I've ever said on the air before, which is I remember a couple months before the bankruptcy, I was lying in bed one night, realizing that Chapter 9 was likely coming, doing some searches on my phone, and came up with this document that Jones Day had written back in, I think, 2011 or maybe 2010. It was essentially a white paper on Chapter 9 bankruptcy, and I remember reading that, and it was thousands of words long, but I read the entire thing word for word. It was like 1 a.m., and I came away from reading that document believing that this was a possible roadmap for the city of Detroit's bankruptcy, and I fired off an email to our entire staff and said, you need to read this. This looks like everything that's happening. It's a playbook of sorts for the legal strategy that you might have or might see unfold in a bankruptcy. And so I felt like from the beginning I had a good perspective on what might happen in Detroit's bankruptcy, and I think you had to look back at what Jones Day had put out in the emphasis on the fact that the city cannot be forced to sell assets, which they clung to throughout the entire case. That was key from a legal perspective, and I think understanding from the beginning was extremely helpful.
So there was also the fact in the Detroit bankruptcy that the presiding judge openly in court encouraged the city to work with the press, to talk to the press, to ensure accurate coverage. I'm wondering how unique that is, and if that was helpful then in keeping that learning curve going the right direction.
I'll say this, as a member of the press, I think it was the right decision because for a city to be in bankruptcy, since the city represents taxpayers, represents the people, if they had tried to do the bankruptcy, under cover, the shroud of darkness or what have you, that I think that would have been a mistake because the voters and the people who pay the taxes deserve to know what was happening at the city. I thought the bankruptcy was a unusual collision of both extremely public events and then also extremely secretive events. Because, for example, when Kevin Orr, the emergency manager for the city of Detroit, distributed his first proposal to creditors, he put out information about the city government that the Free Press had been trying to acquire for years. Just all of a sudden put all this information out that was extremely newsworthy. On the other hand, you saw the secretive mediation process that unfolded throughout the case, in which the participants were technically not allowed to say anything to the press, and so there was a tension there, and as reporters, we obviously had to deal with that.
Yeah, so that's a great segue into something I did want to ask you. It was clear that parts were very transparent and parts were premised on secrecy. This was a very significant grant of authority to a mediator, a very broad confidentiality order, and the mediator was someone with a lot of power, being a sitting federal judge. So your book, though, given that it's really the story behind the scenes, seems based on a lot of information that must have been part of those mediation sessions, or at least meant to be somewhat secret. So I'm not sure your book would have been possible if everyone had honored the requirement of secrecy. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to whether individual people, did or did not honor those agreements. But what I can say is that from the beginning, there were things that were occurring in mediation that were leaking to the public. You can look at the mediation that was occurring in late December regarding the swaps deal that the city had struck with Bank of America and UBS in mediation on Christmas Eve. And on that day, on Christmas Eve, they had secretive mediation talks, and afterward the deal was struck, and then the chief mediator, Gerald Rosen, went into the courtroom and announced it publicly. And I can certainly say that was a huge surprise to the people involved in the case, because they believed that would not happen. So that, I think, did set the tone for the case. On the other hand, I think that I would say I don't necessarily think that anyone violated at least to my knowledge, there was no blatant violations. I'm not a legal expert, but there are many things that we do not know that happen within mediation, and I certainly wish I could get my hands on some of those details. But that I think that the swaps deal was where you saw a very public announcement. But on the other hand, the deal itself was going to be public at some point. So I'm not sure that the revelation of that was any sort of violation.
And I will say that I found the coverage of the Christmas Eve mediation and settlement a particularly gripping part of Nathan's book, even though that's something I followed from afar at the time. The way he tells that story is really quite engaging. Now, I did notice that did you interview additional people to write this book than you had for your reporting on the case?
The book is based on my own interviews, freshly conducted for the book. I was not able to. I didn't want to go back and use old interviews, because I felt like that just wasn't going to be fresh for the reader who's expecting to see a fresh story, built out of this after the case. So the book is actually based on many different interviews I conducted personally for the book, and then also thousands and thousands of records, obviously the filings themselves, and then, of course, emails and other things that I obtained myself. And then also there's a small portion of the book is certainly where I'm citing some publicly published stories, including some of my own. So that would be where you do see some older information, obviously. And then, of course, some of the stories are fairly well known. So I kind of had to dig back into those stories and look for fresh anecdotes and new things that would enlighten the story for the readers. And
so some of the interviews you did, people are mentioned by name, and then others are said to be confidential and subject to their own confidentiality agreements, I guess, with you.
Sure.
How did you and the interviewee decide which way to go?
Well, it's in journalism, you obviously always prefer to have on-the-record interviews, and I'd say 95 to 98% of the book was based on-the-record interviews or documents or public reports. But for the small percentage of people who are not comfortable talking publicly because of their role in the case, obviously the mediation is a very sensitive issue, and so there are some people who simply can't speak publicly, or people who can, but then there are certain elements that they cannot speak about publicly, and that's, in journalism you have a negotiation with that person regarding the topic that's being discussed, and if you feel like they have a reasonable request that they cannot speak publicly about it, then you can, sort of make an educated decision about whether this is worth it for the reader or not. But I always prefer to have things on the record, and I feel like I was very happy with how many people spoke on the record throughout this book. So many people on the inside of the case who spoke openly about their role. I think Jamie Sprayregan at Kirkland and Ellis, Kevin Orr now back at Jones Day, Bruce Bennett and Carol Neville and Sharon Levine and big deal people in the bankruptcy business, David Hyman, who all spoke to me on the record for this book.
And what about the judges?
Well, I can't say too much about everybody who spoke to me. I can tell you that Stephen Rhodes certainly spoke to me for the book, and I have to leave it at that. But Victoria Roberts, one of the mediators, Gene Dreiker, one of the mediators, all those people are listed in the acknowledgments in the references in the notes at the end. So, but I can't list off for everybody for you.
Fair enough. We would be here a very long time given the number of interviews that Nathan did conduct. So I just asked about the judges. Your book gives Judge Rhodes, the presiding judge, the last word of a very dramatic read as a whole. And the Free Press coverage also framed a lot of the reporting around the role of the judges, which you and I have talked about before, is a different narrative than has typically been had about how municipal bankruptcies work. But we also saw the governor and emergency manager as being key parties here. So were you surprised? You have experience with Michigan politics. Were you surprised at the level of cooperation between the federal judiciary and the state government in this case?
Yeah, I think that was extremely unique. Even Judge Rhodes, the bankruptcy judge himself, has cited that as a unique cooperation. So I think that certainly was something that was unexpected. But I think what was probably even more unexpected, like you say, was how influential the judges were in the case, because if you look at Chapter 9, it specifically talks about how the federal judiciary still has to defer to the municipality's wisdom and judgment. And so, so in that respect, I think to see the judges having so much influence was maybe a bit of a surprise. But you look at Judge Rhodes and the role he played throughout this case, and I think he gained a lot of respect among the community and among the people in the case, and such that toward the end of the case, I think a good example of where he understood the role that he had and sort of even admittedly stretched himself a little bit was when the city had shut off water for thousands of people who couldn't pay their bills, and the judge was very upset about that. He held a hearing in his courtroom about that, even though all legal experts I spoke to said he has no jurisdiction to stop these shutoffs. He admitted to me for this book that was something that he understood he couldn't really do anything about legally, but politically he could put some pressure on the city by holding a hearing, and soon after they put a moratorium on those shutoffs until they could educate people about it. So that shows you that they understood the role that they were playing in this case.
Would you expect that if we hadn't been in an emergency management situation and the elected officers were still in power, that level of deference or cooperation would be possible?
That's a great question. I guess I haven't contemplated that specifically, but I would say that I think the case would have been dramatically different had the city been democratically controlled, because in all the other Chapter 9s, virtually all the other Chapter 9s that we've seen of major municipalities throughout this country, they've been longer processes. It's been a slog. because of the fact that you don't have a single individual person in the room who can make instant decisions. And in a bankruptcy, that's what you're used to in a corporate situation with a chief restructuring officer and, of course, a CEO who's intimately involved in the decisions. Here you had that in the form of Kevin Orr, who could ultimately make quick decisions on strategy. And in a democratically elected situation where the city council and mayor are in control, they can debate forever on what to do. So it's extremely difficult to come to a consensus sometimes, and I think that's one reason why other Chapter 9s take so long.
Yeah, I assume, and I think we've seen some evidence, that elected officials for other states have looked to Michigan and Detroit's bankruptcy as giving some ideas of what a very expensive emergency management statute can do. On the other hand, since the Detroit bankruptcy basically concluded, we've seen the dark side of emergency management, of course, in Flint. We've seen some other failed emergency manager situations in Michigan. How do we reconcile those examples?
No, I think it's a great point, and I think it's what happened in Flint was obviously a tragedy that, on so many levels, it's just appalling the fact that the people of Flint have been facing this situation with lead in their water. With regard to the emergency manager there and the role that he played, I haven't not been reporting that, and so I am not that close to it. But I only read the stories that you do. But I can say that what it shows is that that Flint was not democratically controlled, and so when you have a single person in charge, whether or not that person had any nefarious type of intentions at all is really beside the point, because it sort of opens up the city to problems, because they can when one person can call all the shots, then that can be a good or a bad thing. And so in Detroit, however, I think you saw that the city government had failed. The city government had failed the people of Detroit. 40% of the lights were out. Water main breaks were a common thing, and they were destroying people's homes. You had the police department completely unresponsive, and the fact that they were swimming in debt. Ultimately, within a few years, $7 out of $10 would have been paid out of their budget to legacy costs, pensions, healthcare, and debt. And so this is a city that would have been, descending into lawlessness without some sort of drastic action. And so, I think it's difficult to argue that the city government would have done the responsible thing, which was ultimately declare that it was insolvent and try to fix its financial situation.
So those comments, I think, are reflected in the book, that you ultimately have an optimistic outlook on Detroit. Is that fair?
I would say so. Yeah, I'd say cautiously optimistic. But the problem is ultimately, well, there are numerous problems, but the economic circumstances of the city, that is the chronic unemployment, and secondly, the terrible public schools are huge drags on the city's recovery. So I think without addressing those, the recovery will still be sort of slow.
You've mentioned Detroit Public Schools, a part of the city that wasn't dealt with in the prior bankruptcy, but bankruptcy rumors swirl around that system. Any predictions there?
I think that's a great question. I'm following that as well through the press, and I'd say that I think given the fact that the governor is leaning on former Detroit bankruptcy judge Stephen Rhodes as an advisor in the case, and given that Rhodes has reportedly told members of the legislature in Michigan that bankruptcy is a poor option for the public school system because of the fact that most of the debt is secured debt that is backed up by the state, that the state is on the hook for a lot of that, and so the bankruptcy may not be as enticing. But since some of the Republicans are making some noise about considering bankruptcy anyway, it doesn't appear to be off the table. And so if I was in that situation, I think the people who should be most afraid of that are the unions, because ultimately if they did a bankruptcy, perhaps the only thing that would be hit is healthcare and pension liabilities, but or union contracts, which could be severed, of course. So that's something to watch. But the fact that the governor has proposed a significant influx of funding for the school district is certainly a positive, because I did an analysis last year on this before I left the Detroit Free Press and determined that the only way to help rectify the financial situation for the Detroit Public Schools is to give them more money, because of the fact that they can't really shed much of that debt in bankruptcy.
So let me ask you about another debt crisis that strangely seems to have connections to the Detroit bankruptcy, which is Puerto Rico and its debt crisis. Now, many of the professionals that you studied, both in your ongoing reporting and then for the book Detroit Resurrected, are now working in some capacity on the Puerto Rico debt crisis, including Judge Rhodes, who has been a consultant to the Commonwealth as well. Do you have any predictions based on how you saw them working together in the Detroit context? Any thoughts on how the Detroit resolution is affecting those negotiations in Puerto Rico?
Oh, I absolutely think it is, because I think that the narrative that has emerged out of Detroit, which is in general that the bankruptcy was a success because it gave the city a second chance. Now people are considering whether this is an option for other municipalities. Puerto Rico obviously cannot file for bankruptcy right now, or its entities cannot file for bankruptcy under federal law. But like you said, Judge Rhodes has lobbied for, has said that he believes that it should be open to the Commonwealth and the governmental entities that are obviously swimming in debt there. Based on the fact that Congress can't really get much of anything done, I'd be a little surprised if they changed the law here. However, it does seem to be some sort of consensus on Capitol Hill that something needs to be done, and that they won't be able to pay their debts in full. And so the issue is, and I interviewed the governor of Puerto Rico a few weeks ago. He told me he's ruling out pension cuts, which I'm not sure that he'll be able to do that if he wants to get something through Congress, because of the massive pension liability that they have there. So, it'll be interesting to see whether that actually occurs. And I would say also, with regard to the first part of your question, that I find it fascinating that the bankruptcy world and many of the listeners to your podcast all know each other and are friends in many cases. Sometimes they're rivals, and sometimes they work together, and tomorrow they might be enemies. And I think it's a fascinating world, and I love digging into it for this book, because it's just so many interesting people who have such fascinating personalities, and it's just a fascinating business.
So maybe we can end by you offering some lessons for lawyers, whether in working on high-profile cases or others with working with the news media. What advice would you give them?
Well, I'd say this. I'd say that access is always better than a no comment. If you can explain things to reporters, that's critical. I think that especially in a municipal bankruptcy, but certainly in a corporate bankruptcy, educating reporters on the issues is really valuable. And, if you can establish relationships where you can educate them, even if you can't say anything on the record, extremely helpful, because when a reporter can't get access to somebody, ultimately it's harder to present their viewpoints accurately, and that's really what we want to do. So, ultimately the reader is better served if lawyers can communicate with reporters. And the only other thing I'd say is that it has to be fast. I mean, we're under so much pressure in journalism today to report stories fast, and so that's another reason why, if you can establish a relationship ahead of time, educate the reporter, you'll have a much better shot at fair coverage.
Well, that's a perfect place for us to end. So thank you, Nathan Bomey, for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Melissa.
And thanks for writing this fascinating book, which people should absolutely read, Detroit Resurrected, to Bankruptcy and Back, coming out in April. And I thank the listeners of this edition of ABI Podcast. You'll be hearing from me again soon.